Hello everyone who has come and listened. I am Jay. Today I would like to tell you a story. Barron Trump's flight encounter with a veteran sparks an unforgettable moment. Please listen. The flight begins. A moment of fate is set in motion. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, illuminating the bustling crowds moving through the terminals. Business travelers, families, and students hurried toward their gates, lost in their own worlds. Among them was Barron Trump, a tall, reserved teenager, quietly making his way through security. Unlike his father, he preferred to avoid the spotlight. Dressed sharply but simply, he clutched a hardcover book in one hand and his boarding pass in the other, hoping for a quiet flight. As he settled into his first-class window seat, Barron let out a breath, relieved to have a moment of peace. Outside, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the last remnants of daylight fading into the horizon. He flipped open his book, ready to escape into its pages. A few rows back, an elderly man with a faded military jacket carefully stepped onto the plane. His name was Frank Harrison, an 82-year-old Marine veteran with a posture that still held a trace of the soldier he once was. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his face bore the lines of time, each wrinkle a story, each scar a memory. He clutched an aged leather duffel bag, the same one he had carried for decades, a silent companion to a life of service and sacrifice. Frank glanced down at his boarding pass, finding his seat near the rear of the plane. It was a middle seat. He sighed. His old wounds, leg injuries from Vietnam, had been bothering him more lately, and he knew this cramped space would be painful. But he didn't complain. He never did. He simply adjusted, as he had for most of his life. As Frank shuffled toward his seat, the businessman beside him barely glanced up from his laptop, offering no assistance. On the other side, a restless toddler kicked the tray table in front of him, his young mother struggling to keep him still. Frank grimaced as he eased into the seat, already feeling the dull ache in his back. From first class, Barron noticed. He wasn't sure why he had looked up at that exact moment, but something about the old man's quiet discomfort pulled at him. His father had always told him, "Real leaders don't wait to be asked, they just do what's right." Without hesitation, Barron pressed the call button. The flight attendant, Sarah Carter, a woman in her mid-30s with warm but tired eyes, appeared. "Yes, sir?" Barron glanced toward the back. "That gentleman, the one in the military jacket, can I switch seats with him?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "You want to give up first class?" Barron nodded. "Yes, please ask him if he'd be willing to trade." Sarah hesitated, studying the young man before her. Most first-class passengers demanded more, not less. But this was different. She nodded, walking toward the back of the plane, unknowingly setting off a chain of events that would change everything. A decision that shifts the air in the cabin. Sarah Carter, the flight attendant, weaved through the narrow aisle, her polished black flats clicking softly against the floor. She approached Frank Harrison, who sat stiffly, his scarred hands resting on his knees, the tension in his shoulders betraying his discomfort. "Sir," she said gently, bending slightly to speak at his level. "A young man up in first class has offered to switch seats with you. Would you be interested?" Frank's weathered face lifted in surprise. "First class," he echoed, his voice low and gruff, not from rudeness but from years of wear. Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." The businessman next to Frank barely glanced up, uninterested in the unfolding exchange. Meanwhile, the toddler beside him wailed louder, kicking against the seat in front of him. Frank exhaled sharply, his back throbbing against the tight space. But then he hesitated. Why would someone do that? People didn't just give up their comfort, especially not in a world where first-class tickets cost more than some folks made in a month. "Who?" Frank asked, his sharp eyes narrowing. Sarah glanced toward the front of the plane. "Barron Trump." Frank froze. The name sent a ripple of emotion through him. He had served under a man named Fred Trump, a businessman who, decades ago, had done something for him that he had never forgotten. His chest tightened, his pulse quickening. Could there be a connection? The moments stretched. Other passengers nearby had started eavesdropping, their heads tilting slightly, their eyes flickering with curiosity. The businessman beside him sighed impatiently, shifting in his seat. "Take the offer," he muttered under his breath. Frank's pride flared. He hated pity. Hated the idea that someone saw him as a charity case. But was this charity? Or was this something else? Sarah saw his hesitation and sensed the internal battle. "Sir, I think it's just a gesture of kindness," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Frank inhaled deeply. His leg was screaming for relief. He knew the pain would only worsen as the flight went on. But first class? That was for people who had lived lives of ease, not men who had crawled through jungle mud, who had watched friends take their last breath beside them. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right," he said gruffly. Sarah smiled warmly. "Follow me." As he stood, the murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads, watching the elderly veteran make his way forward. The businessman beside him barely gave a second glance, but the young mother with the toddler watched with quiet admiration. Frank limped slightly as he made his way to the front of the plane. The walk felt longer than it should, the weight of his past pressing down on him. When he finally reached first class, his eyes locked on Barron Trump, who had already gathered his carry-on bag, standing tall but unassuming. Their gazes met. Barron extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said sincerely. Frank hesitated, then gripped Barron's hand firmly, his voice steady, but laced with something deeper. "You have no idea what this means, son," he murmured. Neither of them knew just how true that statement was. Not yet. A shocking revelation at 30,000 feet. Frank settled into the first-class seat, his hands gripping the plush armrests as if the moment might slip away. The sudden shift from the cramped, stiff economy row to the expansive comfort of first class felt surreal. He had spent years, decades even, accustomed to discomfort. Luxury, on the other hand, felt foreign. The flight attendant, Sarah Carter, reappeared by his side. "Would you like a blanket, sir?" she asked kindly. Frank nodded stiffly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. He glanced back toward the economy section. Barron Trump now occupied the seat he had left behind, his long legs awkwardly tucked under the narrow tray table. Most kids his age wouldn't even think about giving up a first-class seat, let alone without hesitation. Frank let out a slow breath and shook his head slightly. That name, Trump. It stirred something deep within him, something long buried. His fingers drifted to the lapel of his worn-out military jacket, absently touching the faded Purple Heart pin. His mind drifted back to a cold night in New York, decades ago. A younger version of himself, fresh out of Vietnam, battered and broken, had sat hunched against the brick wall of a Manhattan diner. The city had swallowed him whole, just like it had done to countless other veterans. No money, no home, no direction. Then one night a man had stopped in front of him. Not just any man, Fred Trump. "Son," Fred had said, crouching down so they were eye level, "you served this country. That means something." Frank blinked hard, snapping himself back to the present. Could it be? Was this boy the grandson of the man who had saved him all those years ago? His chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. He needed to know. Sarah, the flight attendant, walked past again, and Frank reached out lightly, stopping her. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low. "The young man who gave up his seat, his name is Barron Trump, right?" Sarah nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Yes, sir." Frank swallowed hard. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thinner. "I need to ask you something," he continued, his voice now carrying an unusual urgency. "His grandfather, was it Fred Trump?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. "Yes." Fred Trump was his grandfather. Frank felt like the ground had dropped from beneath him, even though they were cruising at 30,000 feet. His fingers trembled slightly against his lapel. This wasn't just kindness. This wasn't just coincidence. This was fate. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to glance at Barron again, now calmly flipping through the pages of his book, completely unaware of the weight of what had just been uncovered. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep, shaky breath. He had spent years wondering if he'd ever get the chance to thank the man who had given him a second chance at life. Now, sitting in a seat that he never would have expected, he realized something even more powerful. He wasn't just thanking a Trump today. He was repaying a kindness that had rippled across generations. And Barron Trump had no idea. Not yet. The moment of truth. Frank stared out the window, his reflection barely visible against the endless blue sky. The roar of the engines filled the silence in his head, but his thoughts raced louder. This couldn't be a coincidence, could it? The boy who had just given up his first-class seat without hesitation was the grandson of the man who had once saved him from the brink of despair. The weight of the realization pressed against his chest. He had spent years wondering if he'd ever get the chance to repay Fred Trump's kindness, and now fate had delivered him a moment he never saw coming. Frank took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He had to say something. Across the aisle, Sarah, the flight attendant, noticed his change in demeanor. She leaned in slightly, concern flickering across her face. "Sir, are you all right?" Frank turned to her, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "I need to speak to the young man who gave up his seat," he said, his voice carrying an urgency he hadn't felt in years. Sarah hesitated. Passengers didn't just request to move around mid-flight, but something in the veteran's expression told her this wasn't just a casual request. She nodded. "Give me a moment." As she made her way toward the economy section, Frank felt his pulse quicken. Would Barron even understand? Would he care? A few rows back, Barron looked up from his book as Sarah approached. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level, speaking softly. His eyebrows furrowed in curiosity. He nodded, setting his book down before rising from his seat. Passengers watched as Barron made his way back toward first class. The murmurs returned, hushed but curious. As he stopped beside Frank's seat, there was a pause. For a long moment, neither spoke. Frank studied him carefully. The young face, the steady blue eyes, the quiet confidence. A Trump, through and through. Then, finally, he extended his hand. "Young man," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I need you to hear something." Barron shook his hand firmly. "Of course, sir," he replied. Frank swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He never thought he'd get to say these words. "Your grandfather once saved my life," he said. Barron blinked. The air between them felt heavier, charged with something far bigger than just the two of them. An unexpected connection. For a moment, Barron just stood there, his expression unreadable. The hum of the airplane engine seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet tension that had settled over the first-class cabin. Passengers nearby had stopped their conversations, sensing something extraordinary unfolding before them. Frank swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the armrests as he gathered the strength to speak. He had carried this story for decades, never expecting to share it like this, never expecting that fate would place Fred Trump's grandson in front of him. "I was a young soldier," Frank began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Came back from Vietnam with nothing but scars, some you could see, some you couldn't. I was lost. No home, no job, no family waiting for me. I wandered the streets of New York, barely getting by." Barron leaned in slightly, his brows furrowed. He didn't speak, but his eyes, those unmistakable Trump eyes, locked onto Frank's, giving him the space to continue. "One night, I was sitting outside a diner, hadn't eaten in a day. I was just tired, ready to give up." Frank took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he tapped them against his knee. Then this man, your grandfather, walked out of that diner. He could have ignored me like everyone else did, but he didn't. Barron's jaw tightened. Frank let out a small, almost disbelieving chuckle. He sat down right next to me. Didn't rush, didn't throw $1 at me just to walk away. He asked my name, asked about my service. He listened. The cabin remained silent, passengers now openly watching. Even Sarah, the flight attendant, had stopped mid-aisle, her hands clasped in front of her. He told me no man who served his country should ever be left behind, Frank continued, his voice thick with emotion. Then he gave me a meal, a place to stay, and a job working in one of his buildings. That job pulled me out of the gutter. That job gave me my life back. Barron's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Frank exhaled shakily. I always wanted to thank him, always wanted to tell him what that kindness meant. But life got in the way, and before I knew it, he was gone. Barron's throat tightened. He thought of his grandfather, a man larger than life, yet a man he had only known as a child. He had heard stories of his strength, his success, his business empire. But this was different. Frank's voice softened. And then today, when you gave me your seat without hesitation, without thinking twice, it felt like I was looking at him again. Like the kindness he showed me all those years ago didn't end with him. It's still alive in you. Barron finally found his voice, though it was quieter than before. I never knew. Frank nodded. I know, but you do now. For the first time since the flight had taken off, Barron felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something bigger. A legacy of kindness. The plane's final descent had begun, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign breaking the profound silence that had settled in the cabin. But no one moved. No one reached for their bags or adjusted their seats. All eyes were still on Barron and Frank, two men separated by generations, but now connected by something far deeper than chance. Barron let out a slow breath, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of a name that commanded power, success, and scrutiny. But in this moment, sitting across from a man whose life had been changed not by wealth, not by politics, but by a simple act of kindness, he realized that his family's true legacy wasn't built on skyscrapers. It was built on people. Frank adjusted the lapel of his jacket, his fingers brushing over the faded medals pinned to his chest. Your grandfather didn't have to help me, he said, his voice quieter now. He owed me nothing. But he did it anyway, and you didn't have to give up your seat today, but you did. Barron met his gaze, something shifting inside him. It was the right thing to do. Frank smiled. That's exactly what he would have said. A few seats away, Sarah, the flight attendant, wiped discreetly at her eyes. She had heard thousands of stories in her years working flights, but this was different. It wasn't just about an unexpected reunion between past and present. It was about something bigger. She took a step forward, clearing her throat softly. Mr. Trump, she said gently, I think your grandfather would be proud today. Barron blinked. The weight of those words settled into his chest. He glanced down at his hands as if searching for something tangible to hold on to. And then, as the plane touched down with a smooth glide, he nodded. Not just in understanding, but in quiet resolve. As the passengers stood to retrieve their belongings, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people paused to shake Frank's hand, to offer quiet words of gratitude for his service. Others stopped to thank Barron, not just for what he had done, but for what it had reminded them of. That kindness, no matter how small, can ripple through time in ways we may never fully understand. At the gate, as Frank prepared to leave, he turned back to Barron one last time. He extended his hand, and when Barron took it, the handshake carried something unspoken. A promise. A bridge between past and future. You've got a good heart, son, Frank said. Don't ever lose that. Barron nodded, his voice steady. I won't. As Frank disappeared into the crowd, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He hesitated for just a moment before typing out a simple text. Grandpa would have been proud today. And as he hit send, he knew this was just the beginning. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and leave comments for the story.